The strange origin of the Freemasons doesn't begin in darkness or conspiracy or whispered rituals. It begins with stone, with dust, with hands rough from labor. Because before Freemasonry was mysterious, it was practical. Before it was symbolic, it was physical. Medieval Europe was a world being rebuilt in stone, cathedrals rising slowly over generations, structures so large that no single lifetime could claim them. And the men who built them needed something more reliable than memory or trust. They needed systems, rules, shared language, not to hide power but to protect skill. Because knowledge in the Middle Ages was fragile. If a master mason died without passing on his craft, the knowledge vanished with him. So builders organized themselves into lodges, literal shelters built beside construction sites, places where tools were stored, plans were guarded, and apprentices were trained. And secrecy wasn't about domination, it was about survival. You didn't share trade knowledge freely because it fed your family, your lineage, your future. And this is where the word mason still makes sense, not philosopher, not ruler, not priest, but worker. And early Freemasons weren't powerful. They were valuable because they could do what others couldn't. Calculate load-bearing arches, align structures with the sun, carve symbols that carried meaning beyond decoration. And because they traveled from city to city, they needed ways to recognize one another. Signs, handshakes, words that said you belong here. You're trained, you're safe, and over time those practical signals took on symbolic weight. Because humans don't just use systems, we mythologize them. And when the great cathedral age faded, something strange happened. The lodges didn't disappear, they adapted, because the structure was already there, the rituals, the ranks, the shared language. And instead of builders of stone, they began accepting builders of ideas, lawyers, philosophers, merchants, men who admired the structure more than the labor. And this is where speculation enters the story. Speculative masonry, where tools stopped being literal and became symbolic. The compass no longer just measured angles. It represented moral restraint, the square no longer just ensured straight walls. It represented ethical living, and suddenly Freemasonry wasn't about buildings. It was about character, about shaping the inner self the way Masons once shaped cathedrals, slowly, deliberately, with discipline. And this transition is where confusion begins. Because when symbols replace labor, outsiders stop seeing work and start seeing mystery. Rituals once meant to test skill became ceremonies, passwords became philosophy, and secrecy, which once protected livelihoods, began to look like exclusion. And by the time Enlightenment Europe arrives, Freemasonry is perfectly positioned to absorb it, because lodges were private spaces in an age of censorship, places where men could discuss ideas without church or crown watching closely, and that alone made them dangerous, because power doesn't fear rebellion as much as it fears organization, and the lodges already had structure, hierarchy, loyalty, which meant ideas could move safely inside them. And this is where Freemasonry starts collecting myths like a magnet, accused of influencing revolutions, accused of controlling governments, accused of hiding ancient wisdom, when in reality most lodges were doing something far less dramatic and far more subversive, teaching men to think independently in a world that preferred obedience. And that's why symbols multiplied, because it removes the need for an external ruler. And this is why Freemasonry attracted thinkers, reformers, people dissatisfied with inherited authority, and also why it terrified institutions built on unquestioned hierarchy. Because Freemasonry didn't promise power, it promised order without coercion, structure without tyranny, a moral framework that didn't require a throne, and that made it suspicious, by default. And over time, imagination filled the gaps, because secrecy always invites projection. When people don't know what happens inside a room, they assume the worst, or the grandest, depending on their fears. And so Freemasonry became a screen onto which society projected its anxieties, blamed for revolutions it didn't control, credited with knowledge it never claimed. And this distortion only grew as the original purpose faded from memory. Because by the modern era, few people remembered that Freemasonry began as a labor union, not a cult, a guild, not a shadow government, and yet the structure survived because it worked, because humans crave belonging with boundaries, meaning with discipline, progression that feels earned, and the degrees weren't about ranking worth, they were about pacing, understanding, reminding initiates that growth is gradual, that wisdom isn't dumped all at once. And this is where modern audiences struggle, because we live in a culture that equates secrecy with corruption and openness with virtue, forgetting that some things decay when exposed too quickly. Skills, traditions, identities, and Freemasonry understood that instinctively. Not everything is hidden because it's evil. Some things are hidden because they're fragile. And this is why Freemasonry feels contradictory, ancient yet modern, secretive yet widespread, symbolic yet practical, because it isn't one thing, it's a container, and containers survive longer than content. The tools stayed even as the builders changed. The rituals stayed even as the world transformed. And that longevity makes people uncomfortable because we don't trust institutions that outlive empires. We assume they must be manipulating something, when often they're just adapting quietly. And the strange origin of the Freemasons isn't that they control history, it's that they survived it by never demanding the spotlight, by teaching that meaning is constructed slowly, that discipline matters more than spectacle, that the most enduring structures aren't loud, they're stable. And that's why Freemasonry doesn't collapse under scrutiny, because at its core, there's no grand secret waiting to be revealed, just a method, a way of organizing people around shared values, symbols that remind rather than command, and a system that assumes humans need structure even when they reject authority. And maybe that's why Freemasonry still unsettles people, because it exposes a contradiction we don't like admitting, that freedom without discipline becomes chaos, and discipline without reflection becomes tyranny. And somewhere between those extremes, quietly, without asking permission, Freemasonry built a framework that let people practice order without rulers, secrecy without domination, and meaning without dogma. And whether you admire it or distrust it, the real mystery isn't what Freemasons are hiding, it's why a group that began with stone and dust still feels relevant in a world made of screens. And as Freemasonry grew and spread across Europe, it began absorbing elements from other traditions, borrowing rituals, adopting allegories from the Bible, classical mythology, and even mystical philosophies, not to become mysterious, but because humans naturally layer meaning onto what they already practice, and symbols multiply, not by design, but by habit, because each lodge interpreted the compass differently. Each master assigned their own meaning to the square, and suddenly, a system built for practical instruction became rich with metaphor, and outsiders, of course, interpreted every gesture as secret, every word as dangerous, every handshake as a code for rebellion. But inside the lodges, most discussions were ordinary: moral instruction, personal improvement, charity, the cultivation of trust, the teaching of patience. Yet the perception of secrecy persisted, amplified by politics, by paranoia, by the natural human tendency to fear what we do not understand. And this fear carried far beyond the lodges themselves, influencing revolutions, conspiracies, and literature. And in each case, the lodges became mirrors for society's anxieties, reflecting whatever the observers feared most, whether it was revolution, hidden power, heresy, or simply the idea that someone, somewhere, might think for themselves outside the sanctioned channels. And that is where the Freemasons' influence becomes both real and imagined simultaneously, because the original purpose, to preserve skill, to organize labor, to create trust networks, didn't vanish, it transformed. It spread silently alongside myths of hidden kings, secret rituals, and control over nations. And the more stories that were told, the more the lodges adapted, creating public charity, elaborate ceremonies, philanthropic efforts, scholarship, all to sustain themselves while the legends grew louder around them. And the very nature of ritual meant that participation required repetition, engagement, and observation. So every initiate became a living conduit, a bridge between tradition and innovation, between secrecy and transparency, a practitioner of methods designed to endure, not dominate. And yet the human imagination always adds drama, always imagines an invisible hand, always assumes power is being hoarded. And this is why Freemasonry became accused of everything from instigating the French Revolution to controlling modern banking, when in reality most lodges focused on what they had always focused on: discipline, moral instruction, network maintenance, and the slow, careful transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next, which is ironic, because for centuries people assumed secrecy equaled influence, when in fact secrecy simply equaled patience, a long game of observation, subtle enforcement of order, and quiet cultivation of human habits. And this is perhaps the most astonishing part of the story, that an organization built to teach stonecutting and craft ethics centuries ago evolved into a worldwide fraternity, still maintaining rituals, symbols, and ethical lessons without ever needing to prove anything to anyone, quietly shaping members without coercion, training them to recognize the weight of responsibility, the consequences of attention, and the necessity of discretion. And it is this subtlety that modern observers cannot comprehend, because today, in an age of transparency, everything is measured by exposure. by visibility, by public approval, but Freemasonry survived precisely because it doesn't seek applause, because its lessons are internalized, tested privately, and passed along with care, not broadcast with hype. And when we look at the spread of lodges across continents, the adoption of standardized rituals, the careful recording of minutes, charters, and initiations, it becomes clear that the system wasn't designed for spectacle, but for endurance, for stability, for the quiet cultivation of human behavior over time. And that is why symbols matter, because they encode memory, convey instruction, and maintain continuity. And why ritual matters, because repetition ingrains habit. And why secrecy matters, because the value of knowledge is preserved only when it is understood, practiced, and respected, not when it is shouted into the void. And as Freemasonry encountered the upheaval of revolutions, the rise of nation-states, religious conflict, and cultural transformation, it adapted once again, absorbing Enlightenment ideals of reason and liberty, incorporating them into existing frameworks, teaching men to reconcile tradition with progress, discipline with freedom, hierarchy with conscience, and, all the while, the myths grew louder outside, while inside, the work continued quietly, shaping character, preserving networks, instilling ethics, maintaining tools, and observing patterns in human behavior. Because at the core, Freemasonry is about understanding, not controlling, influence, not domination, practice, not pretense. And this is why even today, centuries later, the lodges still provoke curiosity, suspicion, and fascination. Because humans cannot easily separate structure from power, ritual from secrecy, symbol from conspiracy. Yet if we look carefully, what remains is astonishingly simple. A system designed to endure, to educate, to cultivate human potential over generations, quietly, methodically, without needing to claim glory or notoriety. And perhaps the ultimate lesson of the Freemasons is not about hidden agendas or global conspiracies, but about the power of patience, continuity, and disciplined practice, that some structures survive not by controlling others, but by teaching individuals to master themselves. And if there is humor in all of this, it is the irony that something so pragmatic, so grounded in stone, dust, and labor has been interpreted for centuries as the most mysterious force on Earth, when in reality, the true mystery isn't the Freemasons at all. It is us, the observers, projecting drama, fear, and intrigue onto a system that simply refuses to rush, that values persistence over spectacle, and teaches through repetition, ritual, and observation. And in that sense, the Freemasons remain one of the most enduring examples of human ingenuity, adaptation, and quiet influence, a reminder that longevity is more powerful than fame, and patience more enduring than control, and that even in a world obsessed with revelation, the most profound truths are often those we already see, but are too distracted to recognize.